Welcome to another episode of the Reedman Report, where we talk about risk, technology, and security, and how those elements all come to a nexus with education. A question that I get a lot is school shootings are really rare, and mass shootings are really rare. So when they can happen anywhere, everybody needs to be equally prepared all the time. But risk is actually not equal. I think an example that can really explain this is you can be killed by a lightning strike anywhere in the country. But if you're on the beach in Florida or you're on the beach in San Francisco, your risk of that lightning strike is completely different. And that's because of the geography of those areas, the weather patterns, but also some of the cultural contexts of when and why people heed warnings, how much time you spend in a location, all these different cultural factors. So a couple of years ago, there was a study which looked at the geography of gun violence across the United States. And it was rooted in some work about understanding kind of the nexus between geography and culture back to the history and colonization and population migrations into our country. And today I'm really excited to have somebody I've followed for a long time. Colin Woodward is the director of the Neighborhood Labs at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island. And he is the author of American Nations, a history of the 11 rival regional cultures in the United States. Colin, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
I don't think that gun violence was what you originally set out to study in defining these different cultural regions of the country. Like, where did this idea come from, and where did you start to notice that our nation actually has some very distinct and different regions?
Yeah, it all started with Eastern Europe and the Balkans. I graduated from university in 1991, so my junior year abroad was 1989, and I was a Soviet East European Studies major. And I spent my semester abroad in Budapest, Hungary. I arrived, there was communism. We were going behind the Iron Curtain. When I left, all the revolutions had happened. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and I'd seen most of that. So I went back because that was an amazing experience, and I was already studying this stuff. And I became a journalist and spent my 20s and the 1990s in that part of the world. And that's a part of the world, especially at that time, where the lines on the map don't necessarily follow the lines of nationhood and culture that different people have, and competing ideas about those overlapping empires. It was a time when people were trying to create liberal democracies, sometimes where none had ever existed, where they were reckoning with their history. Once the Soviet occupation was over, the history of your country was suddenly could be something else than what you were told. Fights over historical memory about how to define the nation, who belongs. What's it mean to be a Hungarian? Is a ethnic Slovak living in the Polish Hills a Hungarian? I'm not so sure. What about all those ethnic Hungarians living in the neighboring countries? Hungary used to be much bigger. I mean, these ideas about nationhood and struggles with fascism and fascist regimes occurring, and ethnic riots and use of ethno-nationalism and big lies, all that stuff was what I was reporting on and studying, and later did my graduate work on. And then I came back to the United States towards the end of the 90s. And since then, the United States has been clearly sort of devolving, where some of these issues that I was familiar with in the Balkans were becoming more and more relevant. But also I could see, in traveling around the United States more and living in different parts of the country, I could see that much like when you crossed Romania, you could see the line when you're traveling on the train between what had been in the Habsburg Empire and what had been in the Ottoman Empire. The architecture changes, the layout of the streets changes, the churches change, and the attitudes of the people getting on and off the train change. I could see that same stuff when traveling through Texas or Maryland or Ohio. It's like, I could almost map in my head and discuss with my friends where one historic, centuries old regional culture or nation, if you will, butted against another one. You leave the DC and you drive into Maryland towards Annapolis or down towards the Bay. I mean, there's a point where you leave a sort of industrial German towns named after German places with bergs and stuff behind them, where you had industrial cities and those kind of models. And you rolled into an area that had always been an extension of the Virginia plantation South, with a race-based slave system and commodities growth. And you can almost see where the borders butt up against each other. And the towns are different and the attitudes are different. So, I mean, that where it came from was understanding the Balkans, and then slowly piecing together in my mind this stuff, and then writing a bunch of other books related to American history and American origins. Eventually, in 2011, wrote American Nations, which drew together the thesis that we are this federation of separate stateless nations, each of them mapping back to a different rival colonial project. The New England colonies versus the Chesapeake, aristocratic colonies versus the Dutch settled commercial city-state around what's now New York City, versus the Spanish South to North project in the Southwest, versus the Deep South, which was created by English planters, English slaveholders from Barbados, who'd perfected in the 17th century this horrific slave system, West Indies model slave system. And by the 1670s, it had run out of room on their islands. So they moved to the brand new colony of the Carolinas in the subtropical lowlands of British North America and just splatted West Indies style slave system, serving an oligarchy and so on, right? So these regional cultures go way back, and they, each of these colonial projects essentially settled a mutually exclusive part of our continent. About 2/3 of our continent was settled by one or another of these rival colonial settlement streams through into the 1830s, before there was significant immigration not related to one of these streams. And it's left a mark that is cultural and political and has implications on all sorts of things. You can see at a county level, you can see the settlement patterns pop up in all sorts of things, including rates of gun violence.
What's interesting and why this jumped out to me years ago is that school shootings, the highest casualty rate school shootings, happen almost exclusively in the Deep South and in the Appalachian region of our country. And they happen in a lot of small rural communities, traditionally communities under 50,000 people. And to kind of Colin's points that he made here is that a lot of those areas have been developed by the same communities, by the same cultures for the last 200 plus years. And if you are a small, relatively isolated former industrial or former plantation community in the Deep South or Greater Appalachia, where there's not a lot of economic opportunity, where there's not a lot of education, where there's not a lot of immigration or movement into those communities, you have more or less exactly the same culture in those spaces that's been there for generations. And the ways that people feel about gun carrying, about conflict resolution, about family versus government power over your life, over structures, is very, very different in these regions. So, Colin, when did you start kind of thinking about the way that then this applied to gun violence?
Yeah, so American Nations is published in 2011, and the Geography of Gun Violence, I think, was 2023. I'd done an earlier iteration without my own data, in like 2015 or so, because I was interested in gun violence because it was very clearly, all sorts of indices of violence are clearly sorted by region. There are big disparities between the different regional cultures, not just guns, but deadly assault rates, or even policies like capital, executions. I mean, there's essentially no executions in a whole mess of the regions, often because they're not allowed, or even where they're allowed, they just don't happen, and huge numbers of executions in other regions. It's an idea about justice, I versus an I versus not, and the appropriate way in which you react to transgressions. When is violence tolerated or condoned by the individual? There's been a lot of literature on that includes regional elements that goes back into the 1990s, where people have studied this, not comprehensively across the country, but people have noted like that counties that were settled by Scots Irish, even if there's no Scots Irish there now, have very different interpersonal argument related violence rates than counties that do not. Even if there's no Scots Irish today, like the people have moved on, like the assimilated values and transmitted values over time have still made those places more violent. And the conclusions have been that it's because the norms about how you settle problems are different. Especially, there's a lot of documentation on the Scots Irish who dominated the settlement of one of the biggest regions in my map, Greater Appalachia, which is much bigger than the Appalachian Mountains. It spreads out Texas Hill Country, the lower parts of the lower Great Lakes states, out into Little Dixie and Missouri. I mean, it's a big place. The notion essentially is that if you're at school and a bully's messing with you, the correct answer is to take on the bully yourself, punch them back. Don't bring it to the teacher. You don't be a tattletale. The morally correct thing to do is to settle the problem yourself. Going to the authorities is looked down upon. In New England, it's absolutely opposite. If a bully messes with you, you're not supposed to solve it yourself. You're supposed to go to the authorities who will solve it for you. And that's true of all sorts of things in New England Yankee life. The early Puritans who founded New England were capable of incredible violence against transgressors, but always done via officialdom, right? It's the magistrates and judges and authorities who hang the witches, right? Or throw you in the stock or all that kind of stuff. The individual's not supposed to do any of those things because the monopoly on violence belongs to the authorities. In the Greater Appalachia, it's the opposite. You don't trust the authorities. Getting them involved is being wimpy and is a stain on your character. You go defend your turf yourself. And those things that have implications if there's a dispute, a bar fight or whatever. It's much more likely to get messy if the moral and honorable thing in your culture to do is to take it outside and fight them, as opposed to, let's, go get the bouncer to remove this person, right? Those are two different outcomes. And it's reflected in all kinds of data. So we were interested, knowing that and knowing that there were those differences. I was interested in seeing them not as a little hodgepodge of little data points like academics had put together. I wanted to see if you could look at the entire American nation's regional cultural map and map indices of violence and see if there really was a difference at an aggregate level, and to what degree the regional cultures and their values transcended, say, poverty levels of the community or density or these other factors that might explain these things too. Racial differences, is your place diverse or not diverse on the theory that people are different and more likely to fight each other? Is that true? So what we did new in that article that you're referencing that you saw and the associated research is we were able to, via CDC data, collect all of we weren't looking at school shootings, but we were looking at gun deaths per capita from CDC data at a county level. Both homicides and suicides put together are gun deaths, and we looked at gun homicides and gun suicides separately as well. And what we found were, staggering differences, and differences where if you mapped the rates at a county level, you could see the county level settlement patterns from 300, 400 years ago on the map. It was that profound spatially. But in aggregate, the regional cultures had huge differences. The difference between, say, the Deep South, which has a long history of a culture of honor. Even the gentlemen, would fight duels with each other. You settled things through, fights to the death and all that very easily. You had a legacy of slavery where, in order to keep an enslaved population under control, you used incredible violence and threats of violence to do so. The difference between the Deep South's gun death rate and the greater New England space, which includes, half of Chicago and, Detroit and Milwaukee and the upper Midwest and the, upper parts of, Cleveland and the Western Reserve and upstate New York. The Deep South had twice the rate of per capita gun deaths as Yankeedom, and 4 times that of the Dutch settled area around New York City, a Dutch commercial colony that has given New York City different values and characteristics than anywhere else in the continent, and northern New Jersey and half of Long Island. That area, despite being the most diverse and most densely populated part of the country, is actually like one of the very safest regional cultures to live in, and its per capita gun death rate isn't much different than that of Switzerland. So you're living in totally different worlds. And the in short, when we controlled for things like we just looked at rural counties across the regions, or we just looked at urban counties, or we just looked at gun suicides, or just gun homicides, or just where the victim was black, or just where the victim was white, because that was in the CDC data too. Just poor counties, just rich counties, the gaps remained. Sometimes the rank order would shift in interesting ways, but the gaps did not go away based on any of those things, and sometimes even grew. So, it's a profound difference, and it maps back to beliefs about individualism versus the community, and about how you honorably and correctly deal with conflict and violence's role in it.
Yeah, and I mean, that aligns exactly with the data on school shootings, because lumped into the definition of a school shooting can be the indiscriminate attacks where it's a kid trying to kill as many classmates as possible. The most common situation, which is an escalation of a dispute, and the most common time for those to occur are the transition times at the school, or community events and sporting events at the school, gun suicides, and gun accidents, and finally domestic violence. And across all of those different categories, the Deep South and Greater Appalachia have a significantly higher rate of those types of gun violence at schools. And that has a nexus to the way that a family dispute would be handled if you do it by, killing your spouse instead of going through the court system. Mm-hmm. The way that kids, teenagers, young adults, even parents and older adults handle disputes when they happen at an athletic event, a pickup line, any point of conflict that they decide it's appropriate to shoot somebody in that circumstance, where that rarely happens in New England or in California or in other parts of the country. And then suicides, and the suicides are students, their parents, their community members, their school staff members. Those have the highest rate also in the Deep South and Greater Appalachia.
And it gets reinforced, all these things, in addition to the culture also begats your policy environment, right? Your policies and politics are downstream of your cultural norms. So in addition to all the stuff we've talked about, in the southern regions, and states controlled by, say, the Deep South, are going to have very lenient gun laws, right? Or even have stand your ground laws where, you're allowed to shoot somebody who's advancing on you anywhere in a way that you're not allowed to in states that don't have those things. And so those end up, you have background checks, how easy is it to get a firearm? Those start becoming self-reinforcing on the culture in that way. And then there's this, when I was talking to people and experts to try to understand what the data was showing in that gun violence piece, part of it that kept coming up, whether I was talking to people in the far West, the far West is interesting, the interior West, not the coast and not the Spanish settled part in the lower Southwest, but the whole interior, the Intermountain West, Mountain West, High Plains, that had a pattern unlike the other regional cultures, where usually like a culture that had a relatively high gun suicide rate also had a relatively high gun homicide rate. In the far West, they had really, really low gun homicide. Like your chance of being shot by somebody in anger or whatever in the far West is extremely low. The gun suicide rate was staggeringly high, a pattern we didn't see anywhere else. And I talked to experts out there on gun violence about it. And in the end, it came through that the reason the gun homicide rates are low there and also in New England has to do with the culture around guns. Like, what's a gun for? What's its role in your personal identity? I grew up in a rural part of Maine, way up on the Quebec border. I mean, school would effectively shut down during deer hunting season because everyone was out deer hunting. It was part of the culture. Everyone had firearms. Every single family, it was, you knew how to use them. Your 10-year-old kids out, shooting deer and all that kind of thing. Nobody would ever have dreamed of carrying a firearm, over your shoulder, like for personal defense or just to demonstrate your manliness, or to take it to we didn't have any Walmarts because it was too small, but to take it to a grocery store. People would have looked at you, A, that you're nuts, and B, that you're acting too childish to have this important tool. This is a tool we use, and you're acting like it's a toy, right? And that would have been shut down. And I got when I'm talking to Far Westerners, a sort of similar attitude. We have guns all the time, but we use them for something. And then, when you see people strolling around a Walmart with an AR-16 because they can, that just would not happen in certain regional cultures because it's antithetical to the ideas about firearms and their role. They're tools, not, I don't know, totems of your badassery or something.
Well, they were totems of power in the deep, because it was important to make it visible that I have a firearm and you don't. Because there was the power structure of the plantation owners, and it was both to let the slaves know that we're in power, but it was also to let the lower class whites and other the indigenous population and other migrants know that there is a power structure here. We are the people in control.
Tidewater and Deep South have all of that, right? You're in Deep South, you're often keeping, South Carolina at different points, is like the white overseer class. It was outnumbered 3-1 in statewide, and 9 or 10-1 in certain communities by enslaved people. So yeah, you had a militarized society with the threat of violence at all times. In Greater Appalachia, there was less actual slaveholding. Some small farms up in the uplands. The Greater Appalachians went to places where the export plantation economy couldn't go, and they were often pastoralists. But they're not farmers, they're herdsmen. And the world around, anthropologists have found that people from herding societies have this culture of honor and violence, that the only way you can defend your property, which can be stolen from you incredibly easily, is to have this reputation that if you mess with his car, he's going to mess you up, right? That you don't touch that guy's stuff. And it's that culture of swift, sudden, and overpowering retribution for slights on your honor or your property or your people or your kith and kin are part of Ulster culture and culture of Greater Appalachia to a great degree. And that puts things on more of a hair trigger. And it was, for practical purposes, it was kind of the only way you could defend property that could be easily taken from you.
And I think it's important to frame that, this is not just the findings from your research, that actually there's more and more research that's come out that kind of further reaffirms these. I just saw a map recently that shows at the county level across the country the life expectancy. And we now have a 20-year gap in life expectancy across the country, where people are living into their 80s in the Northeast and on the West Coast, and in the Chicago area and in the Great Lakes. And the life expectancy is in the 60s in the Deep South and Appalachia, which probably maps to a lot of these different cultural conditions. The impetus for us actually talking and connecting over this is a paper that was published using the school shooting database data, looking at a kernel level geographic analysis that is mapping kind of risk against aggregate risk. And in Southern Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky, the risk of a shooting at a school is 20 times higher than the baseline at any other geographic location in the United States. And I overlaid that risk map over your map of US cultures, and it lined up almost exactly along the borders.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me, but it's amazing and revealing that data exists and shows that as well. Because like you say, there's a lightning bolt quality, and you can have a crazy person shoot lots of people anywhere, but with all these other attenuating factors, your risk is higher in places with laxer gun laws and different attitudes towards violence and all of the rest.
Once you have these maps and you understand these cultures, what does it mean? How do you translate it into policy? Or is there, future research? Is there more evidence that you need to gather?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've done a lot of work. I should say, if I phase out, my battery's getting low on my computer, and I'll have to plug it in and get back to you. But I think we'll be okay. We've done research in a lot of stuff, including a whole mess of peer-reviewed research in the health field, social vulnerability, everything from diabetes rates to life expectancy, obesity rates, COVID-19 fatalities, COVID-19 vaccination rates and compliance, poverty, intergenerational economic mobility, FICO credit scores, personal household credit worthiness. I mean, tons of stuff in all different fields. And what it overwhelmingly shows is that societies can be organized, and the regional cultures are organized. They can be individualistic in that you believe that a good society and a free society are best produced by maximizing individual autonomy. In other words, less government, less regulation, less taxes, more freedom for you and me. Or you can organize in a communitarian fashion where you believe that the only way people can be free is by cultivating Republican citizenry, having the schools and clinics and infrastructure that make it possible for anyone, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, to have a chance at being free, at achieving the good life, that you have to have those things in investments. In other words, shared investments in public goods are essential to freedom, or they're the antithesis because they're sucking away like parasites. All societies have that orientation in one direction or another. Our regional cultures have enormous differences on that individualism versus communitarianism value scale, with cultures like Yankeedom, the greater New England space, the Pacific coastal plain between, Monterey, California, and Juneau, Alaska, the area around New York City are very communitarian. The greater Appalachian people, the Scots-Irish, are extremely individualistic. The deep Southerners are too, in the sense of, I as the individual oligarch, I have the liberty and can do what I want. The old slaveholders literally complained about the liberty to own slaves, and that you're taking it away from me. Like liberty for me, the individual, not for society. Those things track to the gun violence issue very clearly. Is the important thing my freedom to have a gun or the safety of the community? Tracks to COVID. I have to shut down my business, wear a mask, and do all these things. I'm healthy, I'm probably fine. Or are you trying to protect the community so some old person you don't even know doesn't die from the disease? I mean, it's an individualism, communitarian thing. Same with environmental issues. All sorts of things, taxation, public investment, track to one thing or the other. And what our data shows in all this different stuff we've done, and from health to politics to happiness, self-assessed happiness. Hey, how's your life going at a county level? The communitarian societies greatly outperform the individualistic ones. Investing in public goods and services makes people wealthier, better credit history, more economically mobile, safer, more long-lived, and so on. And the data is so consistent in one project after another, using different data sources, drawing on other people's literature, that it's clear that if you want a better society, safer, richer, all the things that we want, you don't want to be super individualistic. It's going to undermine freedom and safety and everything else. Now, there's a continuum. I wrote a book called American Character about all this stuff. You go to the extremes of individualism or the extremes of communitarianism, and you end up in tyranny. There's a balance point, right? If you go individualistic, you have no government at all, then the most rapacious people and families will maximize their freedom and enslave the rest of us, like Barbados and under the planters. Or you go in the other direction where all that matters is the common good as defined by somebody who's in charge of the common good. You end up with Orwell and Hitler and Stalin, right? Where the individuals have no freedom at all. There is a magic balance point where you're living in a society that's maximally and sustainably free, right? A liberal democracy, small l, small d. So when you have those forces in balance, what all the data for the US shows us is that our balance point is way more communitarian than even any of our regions are. At some point you'd get too communitarian, like I was in Eastern Europe when communism collapsed. I was there in 1989. State communism was a horrible thing. It made you feel very libertarian. That's not where you want to go. But we have so far to go before we hit the balance point, even in our communitarian regions, that we need to make much more public investment, not less. The times in our history that people look back to as a golden age when we had less income inequality and one bread earner could earn for their entire family and everything was peachy keen in the 1950s. that was an era of, the top marginal tax rate under Eisenhower with a Republican Congress was 92%. Today it's 37. It's 92% on like, what if you had a 92% tax? You can have your first $10 million a year won't be at this tax rate, but above 10 million, it's 92% or 100 million or whatever. Imagine what a difference that would make. Imagine how many fewer Elon Musks and Zuckerbergs you'd have, and how much more money you'd have to invest in all the stuff that makes our economy actually function. What's why wouldn't you have in the richest country in the world a university system and a health system that work well and are well resourced and all the rest? Other countries.
Under that tax structure is when all of the highways that we use today were built. All of the bridges that we use today were built. Airports.
To the moon, build massive public university systems that were the envy of the world, like the University of California system. We invested in stuff. And again, this is like, Eisenhower and, then JFK and stuff, but it was a bipartisan, people call it the long New Deal, but coming out of World War II and into the Cold War, the communitarian shared struggle to win World War II and to face off the Soviets, everyone was on board. You had a bipartisan effort to invest in basic science and, make the investments in stuff that made us the most educated and successful and wealthiest country in the world. And, for the past 40, 50 years, we've been dismantling all of that. And lo and behold, we have a highly unequal society where half the country's being left out and is rightfully angry about it, where the system has discredited itself and needs, replacement. But unfortunately, the demagogues are the ones who are, capturing the anger. I mean, that's these things are related. And in the end, it's a neglect of the public shared things that make us free and wealthy and make for a great economy. Denmark, right? Social democracy usually ranks in the highest and whatever, happiness scores. Hey, how's your life going? Denmark's usually like number one. If you go to like the Cato Institute and say, what's the best free market economy in the world? It's often Denmark number one also. They have a free market economy. They just tax the bejesus out of parts of it in order to finance the infrastructure that makes their economy so competitive, even though they're a tiny country. And you have, good health care and child care and roads and infrastructure and people are happy and all the rest. We know how to make a better society. It's just for ideological reasons, it's really hard for people, especially from cultures that are individualistic, to let go of that libertarian dream that all we need is atomistic individuals operating on their own, our freedom. And no, because there'll always be some oligarchic badass out there who's going to, enslave you and make you a sharecropper if there's no one to stop them.
My final question for you is, as the United States were colonized, as Western expansion took place, as we defeated and pushed back and bought property from the French and Spanish and so on, the states were created in a completely arbitrary manner. Nobody was looking at a map saying, I want to make sure that we equally represent people and places and resources and access. And obviously our states have created an incredibly dysfunctional system of unequal representation. Would the country be better if we organized it around the 11 nations and we had 11 cultural regions that each had their 2 senators and their seats in the House? What would that change? And I want to thank you so much for a wonderful discussion today.
Oh, sure. I mean, the settlement patterns, the map is based on the actual settlement patterns, which, the first settler colonizers laid down the institutions and assumptions and values in places that the rest of us, when we showed up, encountered, and that's kind of what we assimilate into. You might not like it, but it's there, and you're kind of fighting with it, even if the people are long gone. Like New York City is so golden age Amsterdam and Key West. There's no Dutch people. It's like 0.01% Dutch. It's not the people, it's the institutions and society that they created and spun into motion. Unfortunately, though, as a geopolitical fact, the settlement streams are often unwieldy little bands. I mean, they would be really hard to have a country that was shaped, that's 2,000 miles long and 100 miles wide, like the Midlands is. And, every nation or society has big differences. Northern and southern Italy, how can Paris and Marseille be in the same country? That there's big differences, and to have Philadelphia at one end and someplace in around Omaha on the other end of the Midlands, that would be a really hard place to govern as well. So the settlement map by itself, you wouldn't break it into 11, but if you had to redraw state boundaries, and I'm not sure our society is mature enough to open that can of worms, you'd probably want to pay attention to these settlement norms as you like if California was going to break up, there's all this talk about let's break into several states. They ought to be looking very closely at these because if you broke it up along the lines I have, it would be a coherent breakup into 3 states if you're going to decide to do that. If New York City finally achieved its dream dating back to the Civil War of breaking off and being its own state, separate from the dirty New Englanders that used to be that upstate New York had more people than New York City, and so Albany could control New York City in the Civil War period, and they were so angry at the Puritans, as they called them. Where would you break it? You'd want to look at the settlement map to realize where the real fissures are if you were to revise things in that fashion. So yeah, it has importance. You couldn't just divide it 1-to-1 because the geography doesn't often make sense. And remember, it's 300 years for people to go from Philadelphia and Delaware Bay to Nebraska. It's one that zone shares a number of fundamental values things, but to govern as one polity, you'd probably want to cut it into 3 or 4, right? The Midwestern part of the Midlands would probably be a more coherent state than the seaboard part of the Midlands. Ditto for Yankeedom and some other places. Like the Mormon settlement zone starting in Utah, going to southern Idaho, and in the middle of what I call the far west. I mean, that would have, if you were to break up the far west, that would have to be one of the coherent proto-states that came out of it. But it's a good reference tool, but I wouldn't copy it 1-to-1.
Well, Colin, thank you so much for your information today. I hope that it provides some context to folks that we need to think about culture, we need to think about place, and that has a huge impact on risk because a lot of what happens in day-to-day life, whether it's health, education, economics, or just the risk of being shot at the supermarket, is dependent on that cultural history of where you live. Colin, do you have any future projects coming out that you want to plug or anything else?
For sure. Go to nationhoodlab.org to see, our continuing analysis of all sorts of things. We have county level maps. We're usually doing a project, a new something every month on some phenomenon in American or even Canadian life that the regional patterns can be seen in. And we're doing new stuff all the time. You can from there find, where we're speaking, what I'm writing about, what my colleagues are writing about, other research using the paradigm, and so on and so forth. Lots of wonderful color maps and stuff as well.
Awesome. Well, I'll have that in a link. And Colin, I feel like we could have talked for hours about this, and maybe we will in the future when there's some new geospatial research that comes out.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.